much for the invitation, the opportunity to talk to this regional history seminar. As Peter said, I am a historian of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, and we're going to look today at the Anglo-Norman aristocracy through the lens of the Norman lords of Bristol. I'll try and use this to demonstrate the questions that interest medieval historians, because I guess there probably aren't many among us this evening, and also to introduce the range of sources that medieval historians use. So then, conventionally, there are 4 Norman lords of Bristol: Geoffrey, the Bishop of Coutances, Robert Fitzhamon, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, and William, Earl of Gloucester, and there's another one on the end there, the Countess of Isabella, and we'll come back to her. Now, the last 3 form a family group. They are father-in-law, husband, grandson. Earl William of Gloucester died in 1183, so I've transgressed a little bit here. I've moved beyond the conventional periodisation, which usually ends the Norman period in England in 1154. But there are good reasons for doing that, because it enables us to see how this family developed. So let's begin then with Geoffrey of Coutances. Or rather, let's begin with Coutances. It's in western Normandy. And Geoffrey was bishop at a time when it was really something of a wild west. The Vikings had been encouraged to settle in the area that we know as Normandy in the 10th century, and as a result, the civil and ecclesiastical institutions have pretty much broken down. Geoffrey was one of the men who reconstructed them. At this point the church was very much on the cusp of a great swathe of reform that would create the Catholic Church as we know it today. But when Geoffrey was a young man, it was quite a different world. The Norman noble families controlled the church, and there are plenty of examples of churchmen who founded dynasties and behaved for at least half the week as if they were great magnates. They very much took the view that the end justified the means. Geoffrey became Bishop of Coutances in 1049. And he spent the following decade reconstructing the ecclesiastical administration of his diocese and rebuilding his cathedral. At one point he went off to southern Italy, where many Normans had settled, and he secured their support for his cathedral, returning with cartloads of treasure. He was keen on urban development, and he encouraged a trading settlement at Saint-Lô in western Normandy, where he provided a stone bridge and a mill, and he watched the revenues rise. These improvements raised the tolls that were available to him from 15 to 220 livres, so this is a man who's got an uncanny eye to business. Now, Geoffrey was present at the Battle of Hastings, along with William the Conqueror's half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, and it's Odo that I've given you up here as a sort of stand-in, a proxy for Geoffrey. Geoffrey would go on participating in military expeditions for the rest of his life, despite being Bishop of Coutances. In 1069, for example, he put down a rebellion in the West Country at Montacute, and he was a man who was very much well regarded by William the Conqueror, and you didn't get that unless you were a very good administrator and a very good soldier. When William was crowned on Christmas Day in 1066, Geoffrey was the one who was chosen for the special ceremonial duty of asking the Normans whether they would accept William as their king. And bear in mind that's quite important, because the Normans hitherto had had dukes and might be a tad uncomfortable with kings. Now, Geoffrey was given by William the Conqueror over 200 manors as his reward for his part in the conquest, and also to help William hold down the country. And what I've got here is something I've taken from the web, from this wonderful Domesday Map Co website, which is based around colleagues in the University of Hull. And you can put into this website Anglo-Norman figures, and you can see where their lands are mapped across a map in this way, and I think this is really pictorially very good and potentially very useful, I think, for working schools. Going back to these 200 manors then, he has special responsibilities in the southwest, as I think you can see quite clearly there, in both Somerset and Devon. He received possessions worth more than £80. Now, these figures don't sound very much to us now, but believe me, £80 is a lot then. He held a small group of lands to the north of Bristol, and significantly also he held some land in Bedminster and in Long Ashton to the south of the town. His other most important estates were in central England, as you can see from there, and he was a very energetic and effective administrator. I've already told you how he reconstructed his Norman diocese, and his financial and administrative skills enabled him to increase the value of his English estates by 8%. Now, how can I tell you that with so much precision over 900 years? Well, of course, the answer is this, the Domesday Book. So able an administrator was Geoffrey that he helped to compile it. He was the commissioner who looked after East Anglia, because obviously they wouldn't let you compile the bits where your own lands lay. And Domesday is important for us as regional historians because it gives us our first rich picture of Bristol, which lies in the King's Manor of Barton in Bristol. And what I've given you here is the page from Domesday that contains the Barton in Bristol, and then blown up beside it, the actual entry itself. Now, just for ease of reference, shall I do this for you? Because it does make it that tad easier, doesn't it? It's not an enormous undertaking, this, really. 6 hides, that's not massive. 3 plough teams, 22 villagers. It's subcontracted to an individual called Roger. It's slightly more prosperous now than it was in 1066, and notice how Mangotsfield is part of the holding. But the kick is in the tail down here in this red bit, because this is our first picture of the city, or as it was then, the town. The manor, and in particular Bristol, pay 110 marks of silver to the king, and the burgesses say that Bishop Geoffrey has 33 marks of silver in addition to what the king has. So Bristol pays in total 143 marks. Now at this period, Gloucester is paying £80, and these marks translate into £90 for Bristol. So I think we're beginning to see here that Bristol is distancing Gloucester a little bit. So here we have then the first Norman lord of Bristol, and this is the information we've got about him. And I guess he's the perfect candidate, really, as the builder of Bristol Castle. The argument goes, I think, Geoffrey is the king's agent in Bristol. He's built Coutances Cathedral, so he must have built Bristol Castle. That's pretty much the line I think that H.A. Cron took. But that said, I'm not wholly convinced myself. We know that Geoffrey received those revenues from Bristol, and we know that he was the king's agent in the West Country, but we don't know that he built the castle. We have no direct evidence on that at all. We only know that he held the castle, and we know that because he held it when there was a rebellion against King William Rufus in 1088. And for this, we are indebted to something called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I notice in line with all medieval historians, have simply abbreviated to ASC. We all do it, but for the rest of you, it's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And this is what it says about the 1088 rebellion. And this conspiracy was formed during the spring. As soon as Easter came, then they set out to harry and burn and laid waste the king's farms and devastated the lands of all those men who owed allegiance to the king. Each of them went to his castle and manned and provisioned it as best they could. Bishop Geoffrey and Robert of Mowbray, who was his nephew, went to Bristol, and harried and brought the booty to the castle. Thereafter they sallied forth from the castle and ravaged Bath and all the surrounding countryside, laying waste all the district of Berkeley Harness. So he's really in rebellion. Here's Geoffrey in rebellion against King William II. Now, don't worry about it, because he does get away with it, and William II restores him to favour very quickly. I think that William probably was only too well aware, as his father had been, of Geoffrey's worth. But by the time he's restored to favour in the late 1080s, he's pretty much an old man. And by the early 1090s, he goes back to Normandy and he dies in Coutances in 1093. But by then, Bristol is under new management. Now, it needs to be said, we're reconstructing this from chance chronicle references, and we can't be absolutely sure when all of this stuff took place. We know that Geoffrey had the castle in 1088. We know that at some point Robert Fitzhamon gets this land, but we're never entirely sure exactly when this happens. So now we're looking at Robert Fitzhamon. We're in the second generation of the Norman conquest now. A new king is on the throne, William II, and his brother, Duke Robert, is ruling in Normandy. Now, I think sometimes people forget about this. They think William the Conqueror comes to England, and they forget, well, what happens to Normandy? Well, the arrangements were that the eldest son had Normandy, and William II, who was the next son, had England. William II took Bishop Geoffrey back into favour, and he also introduced new men of his own generation, as you might expect. And one of those new younger men was Robert Fitzhamon, the son of a Norman with very modest estates in Normandy, who had remained loyal to William II during the rebellion. And William Rufus rewarded Robert by giving him the lands of Queen Matilda in Gloucestershire. That was William II's mother. She died in the early 1080s, and these lands were in the king's hands, and he passes them on to Robert Fitzhamon because he served him very well during the rebellion. But he did that very much to the chagrin of William Rufus's youngest brother, William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry, who probably expected to get his mother's lands in Gloucestershire. Now, Robert was the founder of this dynasty, which we've looked at before. And I think this is perhaps the point to remind you about the importance of family and the hereditary nature of power in medieval history. Medieval historians tend to make subtle judgments about historical figures on the basis of their marriage alliances. So we should look very carefully at Robert's marriage to Sybil, the daughter of Roger of Montgomery, who was Earl of Shrewsbury. Roger of Montgomery was one of William the Conqueror's closest associates. He'd made an important contribution to the conquest of England, and he'd been rewarded with lands in 11 counties in England. But he also had significant lands in Normandy, which he'd got from his wife's family. So rich and powerful was Earl Roger that on his death in 1094, his lands were split between his two sons, and they were so great that it managed to put both of the sons into the upper reaches of the Anglo-Norman baronage. So, in other words, thinking about Robert Fitzhamon, the marriage between Roger's daughter Sybil and Robert Fitzhamon connected Robert to one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the Anglo-Norman realm. Well, he, I have to say, was something of a man on the make. It's worth pointing out, however, that Roger of Montgomery had been on the wrong side in 1088 in that rebellion, so his acceptance of the king's protege as his daughter's husband may have been the price that he paid for that rebellion. Now, we know next to nothing about Sybil. We assume that she's the youngest daughter because she's always quoted last by the chroniclers in the lists of the daughters. Another important factor is her name. Her elder sisters, there are 3 of them, all have family names, their mother's name, their grandmother's name, but Sybil's name is unknown in the family, and indeed it's pretty much the first documented using of this Greek name in Normandy in England. It's therefore been suggested that somebody in the family made a pilgrimage to southern Italy where there were quite significant Greek colonies, and that's where they heard the name. Now, the underlying point here is that in the absence of direct evidence, medieval historians are falling back on an auxiliary discipline here, in this case onomastics, the study of personal names. So, back to Robert Fitzhamon then. It's for his role in the conquest of Glamorgan that Robert's chiefly remembered. It's asserted that he was invited to intervene in a dispute between rival Welsh chieftains and then refused to leave. And it's hard to get at the truth of this because there are few contemporary sources, and we're relying on 16th century accounts which were probably quite fanciful adaptations of family tradition. But it is fairly well established that there was a general push by the Normans into Wales in 1093, so I think we probably should see Fitzhamon's drive into Glamorgan as part of that. Now, for us as regional historians, there's two interesting aspects here to Robert's Welsh activities. First, that the oral traditions suggest Robert arrived by water, which might suggest that he persuaded the merchant shipping of Bristol into his service. And the second thing is his use of the religious patronage that came into his hands when he got his hands on Glamorgan, or more properly Morgannwg. Robert was particularly generous to Gloucester Abbey. He gave Gloucester the Church of St Cadog at Llancarvan and land at Penhow. And probably in the closing years of the 11th century, before he himself started to show great interest in Tewkesbury. Now, Tewkesbury Abbey was the chief focus of Robert's religious benefactions. If you were an up-and-coming man, you had to have your own abbey. Originally, Tewkesbury had been a cell of Cranbourne Abbey in Dorset, but at some point, Robert decided to establish his abbey there. And in 1102, the community transferred up from Cranbourne to Tewkesbury. And Robert increased the endowment, as I said, from his estates in Wales. He gave his new abbey the parish church of St Mary in Cardiff, which I expect you know, the tithes of Cardiff, the chapel of Cardiff Castle, the church at Llantwit, and the tithes of all his lands in Wales. Now, I pointed out to you earlier that Robert had got on the wrong side of William Rufus's younger brother, Henry, unintentionally, but nevertheless the wrong side, when William gave Robert the lands of Queen Matilda. So Robert might have had cause for concern when Rufus met an unexpected death in a hunting accident in the New Forest in 1100, because Henry then became King of England. The chronicler Geoffrey Gaimar, writing in the 1130s, describes how Robert placed his new cloak on the bier that conveyed Rufus's body to burial in Winchester Cathedral. Now, there were to be no repercussions for Robert from this act, which tends to suggest quite a close relationship with King William Rufus. Perhaps the new King Henry needed all the help he could get, because his claim to the throne was fairly dubious. There was, if you remember, that elder brother, Robert, who was Duke of Normandy, but he was conveniently away on crusade at the time. Our Robert Fitzhamon immediately entered the service of Henry I, and when a rebel coalition formed in support of the Duke of Normandy, Robert Fitzhamon is mentioned as one of the very few barons to remain loyal to King Henry. When the Duke of Normandy landed in Hampshire in 1101 to make good his claim, it was Fitzhamon who went out and acted as an intermediary between the two. So I guess what I'm hinting at here, and I think there's good evidence for it, is that Robert's a jolly good fellow. He has the respect of his contemporaries and the respect of kings and dukes. He probably merited it, he probably won it and earned it. Henry did manage to hang on to the English crown, and he turned the tables a few years later on his brother invading Normandy. Robert Fitzhamon was with him, and it was at the siege of Falaise in 1105 that Robert took a blow to the temple that caused him to lose his senses. He was utterly incapacitated but lived on for a further 2 years. receiving medical care probably from the renowned physician Abbot Fabricius of Abingdon. Robert died in March 1107, shortly after he made a gift of land to Abingdon, and was buried in the chapter house at Tewkesbury. Now, Robert had no son. Let's go back here to this genealogy. But according to tradition, he had 4 daughters. 3 of the sisters entered the religious life. Cecily became Abbess of Shaftesbury, HEFCE became Abbess of Winchester, and an unnamed 3rd daughter became nun at Malling. And it was the eldest daughter, Mabel, who became the sole heir, and she took her inheritance to her husband. And her husband was Robert, Earl of Gloucester. Some of you may recognise this as a 19th century engraving of the effigy that's in St James's Priory. Now, with Mabel's husband, Robert of Gloucester, we enter far more well-known, well-trodden territory. We're now in the 12th century, and much more materials survived. My earlier observations, as I explained, are based on chance chronicle references and what can be gleaned from the religious benefactions. Remember I said how Robert FitzHeyman had given the lands to Abingdon. That's how we surmise that he had received treatment from Abbot Fabricius. From the 12th century onwards, however, there are more chroniclers, more records of the religious houses that the families patronised, and above all, more survivals from the royal administrative system. More bureaucracy, I guess, coalition government wouldn't like it, but more bureaucracy does mean more information. So, let's just refresh our memories here with the family connections. Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was one of the many illegitimate children of King Henry I. He was, in fact, the eldest of Henry I's illegitimate children. There is an obscure scholarly dispute underway about the origins of his mother. Was she English or was she French? It doesn't really matter, but it is clear that the king had plans for his illegitimate children because he arranged for Robert and another illegitimate brother, Richard, to marry heiresses. His thinking here was not simply to make the sons rich, but also to provide them with the resources to help him, Henry, in running his kingdom. You'll remember that King Henry had taken Normandy from his brother, the Duke, in 1106, but it was some time before his rule was accepted. When there was a major rebellion in Normandy in the late 1110s, Robert and Richard fought with their father to put it down. Our Mabel, the daughter of Robert FitzHeyman, had married Robert by 1114, and she took to him all her father's property. And in 1130, she inherited further property from her uncle, who was called Hayman FitzHeyman, and that gave her lands in Kent as well. Now, we probably wouldn't have known much more about Robert, except for the events of November 1120, when King Henry I's only legitimate son, William, was drowned crossing the English Channel from Normandy to England. And there's a famous passage describing this in the Deeds of the Kings of England by William of Malmesbury, which I'll read to you. It was already night and pitch dark when young hotheads, drunk as well as foolish, put out from the shore. The ship sped swifter than a feathered arrow. She was skimming the sea's curling top when, through the carelessness of her befuddled crew, she struck a rock projecting from the surface not far from the shore. The hapless souls jumped to their feet and in a babel of shouting got out iron-shod poles for the long struggle to push their vessel off the rock. But fortune was against them, and all their efforts came to nothing. Already some were being washed overboard, and others drowned by the water that came in through the cracks. Then they got off a small boat with the king's son in it, and he might have made his way back to the shore and been saved, had not his half-sister, the Countess of the Perche, wrestling with death in the main ship, implored her brother to help and not to leave her so heartlessly. Overcome with pity, he ordered them to bring the boat alongside the hull to take off his sister, and this soft-hearted kindness cost the poor prince his life. A mob jumped at once into the boat and she was swamped, taking them all to the bottom. One man escaped, a country fellow who floated all night on a spar, and in the morning told the whole tragic story. No ship that ever sailed brought England such disaster, and none was so well known the wide world over. Ah, the king was understandably distraught. His wife, the Queen, was dead, and their only other child was a daughter, Matilda, and she was married to the German emperor. Within a year, King Henry had remarried, and he'd given our Robert the title Earl of Gloucester in recognition of the reliance that was now going to be placed on him because the other illegitimate son, Richard, had gone down with the boat as well. For the rest of the reign, 15 years to 1135, Robert was at the very centre of affairs. Now, what you're going to ask me is, why Earl of Gloucester when Robert's power was very much exercised from Bristol? Well, here's my thesis. English earldoms were historically closely associated with counties. This was the only one that King Henry had created, and it may be that he wanted to bring out the royal associations of this illegitimate son. Gloucester was one of the three places, Winchester and London being the other two, where the Norman kings had traditionally worn their crowns. Robert himself seems very conscious of his royal associations. Years later, he would issue coins, some of which were recently recovered by metal detectorists near Box in Wiltshire. And Robert's coin shows the English royal lion against a plant stem, indicating that Robert was a royal creature from royal stock. So Robert became his father's right-hand man. And from 1131, we have a very precious witness to this. One of the first, it is the first of a very rich series of English royal records called a pipe roll. And it's a pipe roll because it looks like a pipe. What this does is it's a record of the revenues that the king received county by county, and it also records the debts to the king county by county. It's a classic example of bureaucracy, but it's incredibly useful. The 1131 pipe roll, very first one to survive, we don't get any other ones then until 1155, tells us that Robert had land in 24 counties and was being let off more than £100 of taxation. It also tells us how very well placed he was, because it was Robert who had performed the annual audit of the accounts of the Exchequer in the previous year. Now, at this stage, I want to take a step backwards and review the succession. You'll remember that after his son had been drowned, King Henry had remarried, but by 1126, he'd given up hope of a child by the new wife. So when his daughter, the Empress Matilda, you can see her there on the end, was widowed, he summoned her back to England, and he made the barons promise to recognise her as his heir. He then married her off to the Count of Anjou, and he sat back to wait for grandchildren. But of course, that placed even more importance on Robert, Earl of Gloucester. The king needed to be able to trust him not to challenge his half-sister, or in the fullness of time, the king's grandchildren. And it seems that Robert passed the test with flying colours, because it was his half-sister Matilda who insisted that Robert of Gloucester should be given custody of their father's most important political prisoner, their uncle, Robert, the former Duke of Normandy. And so it was that the rightful Duke of Normandy came here to Bristol and was held here. He didn't stay here for long, because, as you may know, by the time of his death in 1134, he was at Cardiff. So I think this move to Cardiff may have been the result not only of the convenient distance of the Welsh lands from Normandy, but of Robert's building work here in Bristol. Now, we don't know when exactly Robert carried out his major works. We don't know any precision at all here. Major building works at Bristol, in which he created the Great Stone Keep. But it must have been pretty much complete by 1138, when it was strong enough to withstand a major siege. A contemporary account describes it as a castle rising on a vast mound, strengthened by wall and battlements, towers and diverse engines. I'm afraid we don't have anything like a contemporary image, but some of you, I'm sure, will recognise this picture from Millard's 1673 map. And we have a few photos of the vestiges of the castle, which survived right through to the 20th century bombing of the Castle Street area. Contemporaries were convinced that this was fortissimus. It was a very strong castle and the flower of all keeps in England. And I've gathered together some of those photos there. At the same time as he was building this castle, Robert embarked on another major project in Bristol. You'll remember that any Anglo-Norman lord had to have his own religious house, and Robert Fitzhayman's energies had been directed towards Tewkesbury. Earl Robert of Gloucester wanted something a bit nearer home, so he built a priory at St James's on the north bank of the River Froom. Now, he acknowledged the connection of his wife's family with Tewkesbury because he got the monks from Tewkesbury to staff this outpost, and St James is a priory of Tewkesbury. But it was his own foundation, very much his own foundation, and the place where he chose to be buried. We don't know exactly when he started building started to build on this site, except that it was sometime after 1124. Now, we left Robert auditing the Exchequer receipts, and a distinguished historian of the period, Professor Edmund King of the University of Sheffield, has a helpful thumbnail sketch of Robert. He says that the medieval equivalent of the smoke-filled committee room, the close identification with decision-making in a royal court that lay at the centre of the political life of the Anglo-Norman world, this was Robert's natural habitat. From 1135, all of that was to be taken from Robert with the death of his father. While Robert was busy escorting the body back from England and sorting out the king's deathbed instructions, King Henry's nephew, Stephen, crossed the Channel, seized the royal treasury at Winchester and got himself crowned at Westminster Abbey. This was, of course, in direct contravention of the oath that Stephen had sworn, and Robert and all the other Norman nobles, to accept King Henry's daughter Matilda as Queen of the English. Just have that family tree again. There you can see that Stephen is Henry's nephew, and he's the son of Henry's sister Adela. Now, Robert's now in something of a dilemma. He'd never enjoyed good relations with his father's nephew Stephen. There had been frequent disputes about precedence at the court during the past 15 years, and Robert had sworn to uphold his half-sister's claim to the throne. On the other hand, possession is 9/10 of the law. Stephen was in possession of the crown, and the church had placed it on his head. In 1136, Robert came to Stephen's court and accepted him as ruler. But it was a very uneasy rapprochement, and it only lasted for 2 years. In May 1138, Earl Robert formally withdrew his allegiance from King Stephen, and he brought back to England his half-sister, the Empress Matilda. A long, drawn-out war of attrition followed. Even today, historians refer to this period as the Anarchy, and our old friend, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, described it as 19 long winters when Christ and all his saints slept. Here's a passage from a contemporary chronicle. So the people of Bristol, unrestrained in the commission of every crime, wherever they heard of lands or property belonging to the king or his supporters, rushed thither greedily and quickly, like starving and ravening dogs on a corpse that lies in their way. Yokes of oxen, flocks of sheep, any object of desire that the eye beheld, or the covetous heart yearned for, they seized and carried off, sold and consumed it. They arrived very speedily in every part of England where they heard of men with wealth and property. Sometimes they dragged them off by force, sometimes they lured them away by cunning, and brought them at length into the middle of Bristol, the stepmother of all England. Now, this is one version of events, and the clue is perhaps here in the title. This is the Gesta Stephani, the deeds of King Stephen. There is another version of events, written by Earl Robert's own chronicler, a man called William of Malmesbury, so every side has its own spin doctors. Now, in fact, there are the two sides pretty much fought, although we talk about these 19 years when Christ and all these saints slept, the two sides pretty much fought themselves to a standstill in about 5 years, and the warfare was thereafter confined to outbreaks of localised fighting. But from our point of view, there's two quite important features to this. First, that Bristol continued its career as a prison of choice for political prisoners. When King Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, he was kept prisoner at Bristol Castle until his release in 1142. And second, that the struggle between the king and the empress was not without its benefits for the urban classes. King Stephen raised significant sums of money from the merchants of London, while Robert of Gloucester enjoyed the support of the Bristol merchants. And it's also important that the Empress Matilda's son, Henry, spent some years at Bristol in the 1140s. He lived at the castle and he was educated with Robert of Gloucester's youngest son, Roger. Now, Robert died on the 31st of October 1147 at Bristol, and he was buried, as I say, in the Priory Church. Within months, the Empress Matilda seems to have realised that the game was up, and she withdrew from England to settle in Normandy. Some 7 years later, however, it was Matilda's son, Henry II, who would succeed King Stephen in an agreement negotiated after the death of Stephen's son and heir. Now, Robert of Gloucester was one of the great aristocrats of his age. He possessed enormous swathes of territory, was a powerful figure at the court of his father Henry I. But he was also a patron of literature, which is why I've got this slide here. Some of you will be familiar with Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, very influential work in the 12th century. Geoffrey dedicated that to Robert of Gloucester. William of Malmesbury dedicated his Deeds of the Kings of England to Robert, and also his contemporary history, which puts Robert's side of the case in the dispute with King Stephen. So probably great patron or interest in literature, but he wasn't probably a very great patron of the church, Robert. He was, if anything, rather conservative, rather old-fashioned. As we've discussed, he used the Benedictines from Tewkesbury at Bristol St James, rather than encouraging the new and more aesthetic orders like the Cistercians and the Savignacs. So it's interesting, I think, that he did choose to support the Templars, who had been founded to support, to guard the temple in Jerusalem, which had just been won back from the Muslims. He gave them land to the south of the River Avon, where the Church of Holy Cross, Temple Church, still stands, which of course includes Temple Meads. Now, Robert's modern biographer, in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, very good sketch there, says, he was a natural leader of men without much idea of where to lead them. And it's fair to say that Robert's life was a game of two halves, before and after his father's death. It may be that having lived his early years in his father's shadow, he found independent action difficult, hence his indecision about whether to accept Stephen, and in his later years, I don't think he really found a satisfactory role. So that brings us then on to Robert's son, who, of course, is the king's cousin, William of Gloucester. One of the greatest of the Anglo-Norman barons. Here's his seal. Two things to notice here. First, that here we are, medieval historians, using another discipline. This time it's sigillography, the study of seals. And secondly, that this seal seems to have been adapted for William. Now I'm going to have to turn away from your camera here. Can you see here where William's name has been interpolated the letters are different from the rest of the legend around there, and the sigilographers think that that's because they've just patched in William's name until they can make another seal, but it's actually Robert's seal, and of course this seal has the same design as the coins that I mentioned to you that the metal detectorist had found in the box. So there's the royal lion, there's the stem of Jesse behind. William then, cousin of King Henry II, trying hard to be son of his father. Here's the family tree, again, just to refresh your memory. He had an excellent start. Total income may have been more than £700 a year. I know it doesn't sound much, but it was. Let me put it in another way. He commanded the service of more than 300 knights from England and Wales. And we know this because, more bureaucracy again, King Henry II asked all his barons to fill in a knight return in 1166. They had to tell him how many knights, and of course that's a very good indication of how wealthy they are, how many knights they can support. There's some evidence, however, that William was not the man his father had been. One contemporary chronicler described him as soft and more interested in matters of the bedchamber than in warfare. Certainly his military career had got off to a bad start when he lost his father's castle of Wareham to King Stephen's forces in 1142. And when his father died in 1147, William's mother, the Countess Mabel, initially exercised joint authority with him. William was then provided with a wife to whom he was much devoted, which may explain the second aspect of the chronicler's remark. She was HEFCE, the daughter of the Earl of Leicester, and the Earl of Leicester had been a supporter of King Stephen. The marriage was a sign of the increasing desire for peace among the magnates in the final years of King Stephen's reign, and HEFCE appears at William's side in many of the documents that he issued. Now the new king, Henry II, and there on the far side, cultivated William during his early years in England. William often appears as the first witness in Henry's early charters, and there are signs of more material favours. The pipe rolls, remember, show us that he was excused taxation and other debts to the crown, and William's mother, the Dowager Countess Mabel, received lands from the king in 1155. So the family's retaining a hold here, but it's hard to escape the conclusion, I think, that William failed to make the most of his opportunities. He began to appear less and less at the royal courts, and probably went down in his royal cousin's estimation. Meanwhile, however, Bristol was prospering. Henry II had shown favour to the town by granting it a charter in 1155, granting the burgesses freedom from his tolls in England, Normandy and Wales. And Robert Fitzharding, who was the son or grandson of the Saxon bailiff of Bristol, was doing very well. I was going to say making lots of money, but it seems that it was his brother Jordan who was the local moneyer and not Robert. Robert Fitzharding's resource was going into the Augustinian Abbey, which he had founded in the manor of Billiswick, which of course is still over there. Earl William gave the canons the manor with the marsh, which lies between the aforesaid place and the river Avon. Here's the Latin, cum maresco qui jacet inter predictum locum et Athman, and that's the first reference to Canon's Marsh. Now, local people also gave the canons of St. Augustine's property, particularly, interestingly, gardens. And I think this is quite interesting because I think this tells us that there's market garden activity here which is necessary to provision an expanding population, and the monastery is getting a handle on that. We also know at this time that the suburbs of Broadmead, Redcliffe and Old Market were developing fast. Earl William gave Bristol fair, which was held at Pentecost, to St James's Priory. Pentecost is, of course, Whitsun, and that's how you get Whitsun Street down by St James's Priory. And this, of course, is the origin of the fair that continues until the 1830s, and which we've got that wonderful picture of in the 1830s. And here is William's charter, where he's giving that to the monks. And here is the Countess HEFCE, as ever, at her husband's side. Now, things began to come a bit unstuck in the 1160s. In 1163, William's brother Roger became Bishop of Winchester, just in time to become embroiled in the controversy about Thomas Becket. And then, in the mid-1160s, William's only son Robert fell ill. Despite William's offerings for the health of his son, the young man died, and William founded an Augustinian abbey, an offshoot of St. Augustine's, in his memory. This is a really important local foundation and described in Andy Foyle's wonderful new revision of the Pevsner as rich and important, and the Norman stonework particularly fine. Now, Andy's done a fantastic job of going out and finding lengths of stone wall in people's back gardens that might have been part of the cloister and so on. And it's a fantastic job because actually the Keynsham bypass runs through the cloister. Anyway, so he's lost his son. Then relations between William and King Henry began to deteriorate over Bristol. As we know, Henry II was familiar with Bristol, having spent his period here in the 1140s. He must have had a very shrewd idea of its potential. He didn't miss very much. At some point before 1173, Henry seized the castle back from William. He was entitled to, it was a royal castle, and it was granted to the Earls of Gloucester. This was the period of Henry's Irish expeditions, and he was provisioning a fleet from the town, and we know all this from these pipe rolls. Seizing the castle may have been a means of keeping the fleet secure, but Earl William was not best pleased, and he reacted by expelling the royal garrison. He was therefore brought before the King's Court and forced to surrender the castle completely in 1175. And from then on, the pipe rolls make it clear that the provisioning and repair of Bristol Castle was at the King's expense, so it's back in the King's hand. Bristol was clearly becoming too important to the King to be left in the hands of a cousin that he didn't entirely trust. Now, Earl William fought for King Henry in the War of 1173-4 when Henry's sons rebelled, even to the extent of fighting his brother-in-law, Countess HEFCE's brother, who was on the other side. But Henry remained suspicious of William. In 1183, he arrested William and he held him in confinement until William's death on the 23rd of November 1183. And that's the point at which the Norman lords of Bristol come to an end. William was buried at Keynsham Abbey. It tells you something, I think, about the family connection with his son. Henry II marked the occasion by taking into his wardship the earldom of Gloucester and his cousin's only remaining daughter, unmarried daughter, Countess Isabella, whom I mentioned at the beginning. Now, the chronicler Robert of Toigny described Isabella as being in the hand of God and the Lord King, and to whomever he wished to give her. That's what the Latin there says. Toynbee was right to have a sense of foreboding here, because Isabella became her father's heir, and she was given in marriage to King Henry's youngest son, John, and he was to be as bad a husband for Isabella as he was to be a king for England. But that's another story. Now, in conclusion, when I asked Steve whether I could do some medieval history for you, he said that it would be fine, as long as there was a regional dimension. So that's how I came to choose this topic. On reflection, I think this topic opens up the really great question of regional history, which is namely the relationship between Bristol and Gloucester. When the period opens, Gloucester was a county town, it had prestigious monastic community, it was so important, it was the place where the King of the English chose to wear his crown. During the course of this period, the rise of Bristol is almost palpable. You can sense the flexing of the muscles. The archaeological excavations in Redcliffe Street have dated the development of the wharves there to precisely this period between 1120 and 1150. I've structured this talk around the personalities because it gave us a useful framework, but I hope that I've given you an insight into the variety of sources that medievalists use, but above all, I hope that I've given you an understanding of how medieval history lies at the heart of the great questions that still preoccupy us as regional historians.
Brilliant.
Well, you better be in camera.
By the mic, please.
By the mic, yeah. Thanks so much, Kathy. Now, I found that absolutely fascinating. The way in which, as you were saying, personalities and family history interacts with both national, international history, but also with local history, with the development of Bristol and development of Gloucester. I'm tempted to ask a question myself, but I'm sure there are lots of questions from the floor. So I'll give you a chance first of all. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about the Templars? Because why did Robert give land to the Templars, for example? Were they bankrolling Matilda in the Civil War, for example?
We have no idea why. We can guess. It might be something to do with devotion and a commitment to what was going on in the Holy Land. It was very much the thing to do to go and fight the Muslims in the Holy Land. If you couldn't go, and Robert's preoccupied, isn't he, with this kind of, first of all with supporting his father and then with this conflict with King Stephen, maybe he felt he ought to go, maybe this was a proxy that allowed him to say, oh well, I'm bankrolling the Templars. Maybe there is an element of what you've described, maybe, because they are well known for their banking activities, though I don't know if it's as early as this, and I don't know enough about the Templars. Someone else may be able to tell you that. It is an interesting development. It is the one 12th century order that he patronises. Apart from that, he's very, very conservative. And we only know about it, the actual documentation that describes his act is a confirmation from later in the 12th century. We going back to this charter thing, we don't have one of those issued by Robert for the Templars. So, as with a lot of this stuff, we're piecing it together from later evidence. So I'm sorry, it's not a fuller answer.
Do you know roughly what the date was?
We don't know when he did it. No. So it's sometime between when he gets possession of Bristol, which is probably in the 1114, and his death in 1147. Now there may be other means of narrowing that down that I don't know about, but from the documents, that's all I can say.
Steve.
That was fascinating, actually. And well, what I'd like to know is, can you say something about the relationship between these lords and their relationship to the government, local government of the region? Do they have, what's their responsibility for the people who live in the region or live in Bristol? How do they interact, or don't they? What do we know?
Medievalists tend not to like the word government very much.
Okay, which word would you prefer?
Because
tyranny.
Because it implies structures and institutions which probably aren't there at this period. We talk about power.
Okay.
That's the kind of way
So
that we
what is
frame it.
What is his relationship to the exercise of power
Well, having said that, I talked a little bit about the pipe rolls, and
Yeah.
the pipe rolls are the record of the king's agent within the county. So there is that much institution. So the king has a sheriff in each county, and you have that kind of relationship. And sometimes some of the nobles actually take on the duties of sheriff, because that gives them access to the king's lands within a county. But of course, what's also really interesting about this period is that this is the point at which local government in the city starts to take off. We don't know very much about it, but we do know from the pipe rolls that the burghers of Bristol, the townsmen, offered the king a certain amount of money that they didn't have to go, in order to buy the privilege not to go to Gloucester to take part in the king's court there, and later on they buy the privilege of having a court here. So I think there must be some institutions, but I haven't. What we're doing, medievalists, all the time is inferring from the evidence that we've got, but we don't have the bits of paper that support it. Now, Henry II gave that charter to the burgesses of Bristol, so it does imply some sort of commonality, doesn't it? But we can't say very much
But
about how
do you think he
operative.
has to? Is he concerned about his local reputation? Does he need to exercise paternalism and care? Or
Yeah, I think he's building relationships with these burgesses because they're helpful people to have, and they control the shipping, and the shipping might get his armies over to Ireland. So yes, that's one factor. He wants to get them on side. He gives them exemption from his tolls. Terribly interesting. Did you notice where he gave the exemptions? England, Normandy and Wales. He's also Duke of Anjou, and in the right of his wife, Duke of Aquitaine. So where might we start to be trading with in this town in the 12th century? Might we perhaps be seeing the beginnings of the trade, the wine trade? And if so, he's not going to rescind the tolls on that. I think that almost tells you that. But again, you see, it's all inferring. This makes sense to you, I guess, doesn't it, Peter, as a fellow medievalist? You know, you're having to make these kind of intuitive leaps all the time, and sometimes I think we push them too far, don't we? But that's how we're operating.
okay.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, he is buying favour. He's building alliances, and I mean, just in the way, I guess, that later on, you build parliamentary alliances in the 19th century House of Commons. He's building alliances with local magnates, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Some kings are more successful at it. Henry I is really good at keeping all his barons on side. Henry II is really good at it. Stephen was not. And the reason why Stephen was not was because there was a fundamental weakness to his claim, and he was also a man that they almost felt they couldn't do business with. So there's a lot of interaction of the personal and the institutional here. Gentleman at the back there.
My question kind of follows on from Steve's in a way. You showed that very interesting map of how Geoffrey of Coutances had his lands spread out over a big area of England. Now that seems like a recipe for mismanagement, or at least inefficient management of the land. So why did William spread out land in that way? Was it to weaken the lords? But then the payoff, or the downside of that, what must have been inefficiency in the management of the land, wasn't it?
Everything you've said is the classic explanation. Yes, you spread out the holdings so that you don't have very strong power bases, or these local lords don't have very strong power bases. He's not particularly worried about inefficiency, is he? As long as his lands are nice and tightly held together and he can get maximum benefit, if they're kind of kept busy by looking after their lands, so be it.
Can we infer, or is it known how lords managed their lands that were far away from where they lived. You know, these days you'd have local managers in
Yeah.
place, wouldn't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Did
I
it work
think-
like that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what they did. There are two approaches we can talk about here. One is that where you have property that's a long way away from your general centre of influence, what lords tend to do is to pass it on to one of their subordinates, and it's their bit of patronage, their means of keeping that man on their side. So that's one approach. You can simply give it away and buy your knight's service with it. And the other approach is to put managers in. Now, we don't know very much about the managers, the bailiffs, the reeves, as they're called in this period. But when you get into the 12th century, you begin to get some state surveys, mostly for the monastic estates rather than the lordly estates, which kind of describe, what the revenues are and the rent rolls and all those kind of things. So yeah, it's the same answer really. We don't know, but we infer. Lady there?
Kathleen, that read was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. You referred to Robert's endowment of the Priory of St James, and you suggested the conservatism, perhaps, of his patronising the Benedictines at that time. Perhaps the significance of his endowment of St James is Bristol's very powerful and important connection with the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. I mean, Bristol was perhaps the most important port of embarkation to Santiago, with hundreds, perhaps thousands of pilgrims every year going through Bristol. And of course that is not then just if you like, a religious phenomenon. It's a massive commercial phenomenon, with Bristol picking up trade with Spain, establishing trade with Spain and Portugal. I mean, I don't know whether that's how you might see it too, but I mean, I think there is a very interesting...
No, I haven't seen it like that at all, and that's a really helpful, and thank you for that wonderful insight, because that's something I have not been aware of, but yes, I can see St James, yeah, that would make very good sense, wouldn't it?
And as I say, the foundation growing of the trade with Spain and with Portugal in experience themselves.
If I may, it probably depends on knowing about the scale of the pilgrim trade at the time of the foundation of St James's. And do we know how big the trade was in that time? How much activity was actually going on?
That's an interesting question, Peter, which actually perhaps we can follow up afterwards. I mean, I actually don't have with me all the data about that, but there is data.
Right, yeah.
I would imagine that it's quite substantial by the 1120s, simply because the early... we talked about Earl Roger of Montgomery, and a couple of his sons went down to Santiago de Compostela, I think in the 1070s and 1080s. So I would think by 1120, if they were going then, every man and his dog's going by 1120. Yeah, and of course that would make very good sense, wouldn't it? Straight across the Bay of Biscay if you were brave enough. Yeah, thank you for that. Gentleman at the back?
You mentioned in passing the Fitzharding family,
Yes.
and then at the end you related the difference in influence of Bristol and Gloucester during the course of the period. I realise the Fitzhardings were slightly later in terms of their influence, but is the weakening of the Norman lords related to the rise of the Fitzharding influence in Bristol, for example?
I don't think so. I mean, the Fitzhardings are certainly building themselves a power base here, but the Norman lords, the Earls of Gloucester, they've got property all over the place, haven't they? This very extensive block of lands around Tewkesbury and Gloucester in general. They've got lands down in Devon and in Somerset. I wouldn't have seen them as rivals, but I don't know. I mean, Peter, you're an urban historian more than I am. Do you have a sense of that?
I don't actually. In fact, I was going to ask you that question about any possible rivalry or cooperation between the two.
My sense is cooperation, but
Yeah.
there may be others here who know more than I do. One of the things that in the process of preparing this talk, I did was to look at some numismatic material which I'd never looked at before, and there's been some very interesting work done on Robert Fitzharding and his brother Jordan, and whether they were the moneyers and the importance of moneyers in the city in the 11th century. They were obviously extremely significant. They'd been significant for a long time, so anyone, I think, who came in as the lord of this town had to get on with them. But I never picked up any sense of tension there. But maybe others have. You know, I mean, I'm by no means.
I mean, my feeling is that you've got the kind of the city boss, and then Gloucester comes in as a layer above that. But as you say, it seems to be a relationship of cooperation, because they're kind of working at two different levels in a way, aren't they?
Yes.
But they both need each other.
And would that account, for example, for the different patronage from the Benedictines to the Augustinians? Actually keeping themselves separate. In other words, they weren't actually trying to cross over each other's boundaries, so to speak.
Yes, I suppose it could do. I mean, the Augustinians are a tad more up to date, aren't they, than the?
Yeah.
But when we're not into the sort of real avant-garde of the Cistercians.
No.
It is quite interesting that Robert has or apparently no interest at all in these orders which really preoccupy many of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy in the 12th century. And people like St Bernard of Clairvaux, he was a fantastic self-publicist, and everyone was so kind of seduced by his preaching and so on. And the money was pouring into the Cistercians, and these houses were being set up all over Western Europe. Robert has no interest at all, and only in the very tail end of his life does he kind of confirm the grants made by one of his followers in Glamorgan, and that's the only link I can find. But it's an interesting observation.
Any other interesting observations or questions? I wanted to ask, and this is probably an impossible question to answer, but you did kind of indicate it right at the end, in looking at the relative trajectories almost of Gloucester and Bristol. And it does raise this question which relates to what Steve was saying earlier, in a way. The extent to which that success is because of the promotion, the influence of magnates, local magnates, or to what extent it would happen anyway because of economic factors.
Well, there's economic factors, and of course the other great thing with Gloucester is that in Gloucester, at the time when Robert is lord here, there was a very ambitious castellan called Miles of Gloucester, who is the founder of a short-lived dynasty of Earls of Hereford, whom David Walker did a very fine study of. And you just wonder whether there is tension there. Towards the end of, during the anarchy, they actually have a treaty, Robert of Gloucester and Miles of Gloucester, and you sort of think that's where the tension is, I think, rather than Robert Fitzharding and Robert Earl of Gloucester. So Miles of Gloucester is castellan of the royal castle in Gloucester. He has control of that. It looks like our castle here comes into the hands of Fitzhamon and then goes on to Robert of Gloucester. and that's what it's possession of the castle that makes the difference. But these economic factors then really come in underneath that.
I read somewhere that Robert Fitzharding bankrolled Robert of Gloucester
Yeah.
and Henry II.
Yeah.
when he was
There
a duke.
is.
So he was
There is
providing
some.
the cash.
Yeah, some evidence that of loans, yes. And I think I made the point that King Stephen and his queen, who's also called Matilda, they raised money on the London capital markets. You know, they raised money in London, and so obviously Robert of Gloucester falls back on what he's got here, and Robert Fitzharding lends him money. Yeah. And then. Of course, Robert Fitzharding gets his hands on Bedminster, and you wonder if that's in part payment for the debt.
And Berkeley.
Mm. Yeah, but Berkeley's a royal manor, I think. I can't be sure, is it?
Yes, it's a result of the first Lords of Berkeley's rebellion, isn't it? And it's confiscated and then it's given to Fitzharding.
Yeah. So I don't think it comes through Robert exactly. It comes from the king.
But what's going on behind the scenes, of course, is
Some
another
fixing.
question. Yeah.
Just an observation. I hope I'm getting this right. Henry I, I believe, either founds or sufficiently enlarges Reading Abbey, which is Benedictine, and of course the main relic kept at Reading Abbey was the hand of St James. So I'm wondering if what's happening here in Bristol is an emulation of what your relative, half-relative, back in Reading is doing with both the Benedictines and the St James catch.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that as well, because that links up with your point, doesn't it, about St James? Yes, Reading, very interesting. You know, I mean, Henry I's mausoleum, again, quite old-fashioned in approach. They're Cluniac monks, but really, really sumptuous building. That's always puzzled me a little bit. You know, I mean. William, Earl of Gloucester, put significant resources into Keynsham Abbey. Robert Fitzhamon put significant resources into Tewkesbury. Poor St James's Priory is not quite on the same scale, is it? I wonder if it's because Robert is still pumping money into Tewkesbury. But, you know, you don't get that same sense of his mausoleum being as grand as the Tewkesbury place for Robert Fitzhamon and his dad's place at Reading. But yes, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, second bite. But going back to sources, actually, you very kindly mentioned some of the sources. Would you like to comment on the reliability of those sources, particularly Geoffrey of Monmouth, for example?
Yes. I mean, one wouldn't use Geoffrey of Monmouth for historical accuracy. One would use him for kind of what it tells us about the literary and cultural environment. Here is a man. What Geoffrey of Monmouth tells us is that suddenly people who perhaps in a generation before would have spent all their time fighting now managed to find time to sit down in the castle solar and have a book read to them. And maybe they're literate themselves. You know, what we're looking at here is the growth of a different kind of culture, and that's what Geoffrey tells us. William of Malmesbury, on the whole, tends to be much more respected, and people talk about the reliability of his work, how he looks at evidence, and he's judicious in the way that he handles it. I'm a bit wobbly about that. When I'm using William of Malmesbury, I just like to think about what angle he's coming at an issue from. Gesta Stephani, well, it's in the title, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's Geoffrey's, it's Stephen's book. So yeah, I mean, as with any source in any period, you're always making those kind of judgments. And I guess, you know, in the early 20th century, when historians got really excited about this sort of stuff, let's go away and use the documentary material because there's no bias and there's no axes to be ground in this. And a huge school of documentary source criticism emerged, particularly from Oxford. Only now we're beginning to start thinking that some of this stuff is coming with its own agenda, particularly, what do you record? Which particular acts do you record? Why do you record that one? Who are the witnesses on it? What's the story you're trying to tell in this particular document? So, yes, it's not a good historian who doesn't look for all those kind of questions. Does that answer your question, or are you thinking in terms of things like, because the sigillography and the onomastics and all the other things, we're very much in the hands of our specialist colleagues here. I mean, when I kind of tread into numismatics, I feel that I'm on eggshells sometimes, because it really is so technical. But the insights that you get from it, I mean, the coin that the metal detectorist found and the seal and so on, it's fantastic. You almost see into the head of the people.
As a real novice, where did Robert Fitzharding come from? How did he become so powerful?
Are we looking at Robert Fitzharding or Robert Fitzhayman? I'm sorry.
No, Robert Fitzharding.
Well, I mean, he's a Bristolian, isn't he? He's one of us. As far as we know, he is either the son or possibly the grandson of a man called Harthing, who was the royal reeve, the bailiff here in Bristol before the conquest. So if you want to write a novel about Fitzhardings, they're up for it, I think. They would make a very good novel. And you could look at all this stuff about, as Peter says, the local boss. He's got access to lots of stuff. And, remember I talked to you about the gardens.
Yeah.
The person who gave the gardens to St Augustine was Robert Fitzharding's sister. So, they're everywhere. Yeah, they're really interesting.
And he's obviously of a family of trimmers, because for Harthing the family to prosper either side of the conquest is quite rare, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And what happened to Isabella, Countess of Gloucester?
Well, I did say that's another story. How long have you got? She marries King John. She's married to King John throughout the reign of Richard I. It's not a happy marriage. She has no children. When Richard I dies and John succeeds him, you can't have a childless wife if you're a king. So I'm afraid she's put to one side, but it's worse than that, because she's back on the marriage market, because she's carrying this dowry with her, isn't she? She's carrying the earldom of Gloucester. And she is effectively auctioned off to the highest bidder. And she makes 2 further marriages to people within John's circle, each time carrying this dowry with her. And in the end, I've got a feeling she pays a significant penalty fine in order not to have to do yet another marriage. And I think she dies sometime in the middle 1210s. I can't be absolutely sure, but there is a study of her, I think, in the new Oxford Dictionary of National Biography that will give you all of those details. She again would make a wonderful study. And then after her death, the property is split up. She has 2 sisters who are dead by this point, but they have children. The property then goes down to, I think it's the Clares, am I right? Yeah, the Clares, and eventually ends up again with heiresses. But the kind of this sort of marriage market thing, where women's value is determined by the property that they carry with them, and also their ability to bear children, is to modern eyes quite shocking. Yeah, quite shocking.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, I think we've kept Kathleen long enough, but I really do think this is absolutely fascinating. So thank you, and I'm sure we've all been fascinated by this, and I'm sure we'd all like to thank Kathleen once again for this really interesting talk. So thank you.